There is no one standard definition of what is regenerative leadership.
From a permaculture angle, we're looking at taking care of the people, taking care of the planet.
Top-down pedagogies didn't necessarily work for farmers.
Hello and welcome to the Permaculture Vine podcast. Today's roundtable episode is on regenerative leadership and permaculture. So today we have three great guests. So we have Sarah, Aimee, and Christopher. If you want to just introduce each other, introduce yourselves there. Sarah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm Sarah Spencer. I'm founder of Think Like a Tree and Think Like a Forest, and author of Think Like a Tree, The Natural Principles Guide to Life. So I support individuals and businesses and organisations to transition towards regenerative, and I have a diploma in applied permaculture design. So that's kind of where my love of learning from nature stemmed, and then it's kind of just rippled out from there.
Hi, my name is Aimee. I'm based in the south of Spain. I've been in the permaculture area of work for the last 10 to 12 years. I come previously from a career in finance and wealth management, so very different to permaculture. And at the moment, I'm very heavily involved in the International Permaculture Collab, where I lead quite a few circles and initiatives in a self-organized space. So it's a very lived-in, let's say, regenerative leadership there. So I'm looking forward to talk more about that soon.
Oh, hello. My name is Christopher Nesbitt. I am the one of the founders of the Maya Mountain Research Farm located in San Pedro, Colombia, Toledo district of Belize. And I run the farm with my wife, Selene Logan Nesbitt. And our primary focus is on trees. So, and yeah, that's about it.
And I'm Cormac, your host. I'm in Northern Ireland, permaculture designer and permaculture student, I suppose. Thanks guys for coming on. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to hearing all the different perspectives. So I suppose where we start is, what is regenerative leadership and how does that tie in with permaculture? Sarah, do you want to have a go at that first?
Yeah, so I mean, there is no one standard definition of what is regenerative leadership, but regenerative in general is all about this idea of creating life and also aligning ourselves with living systems, so the way that life operates. So for me, that means leadership being inspired by natural principles and operating in a way which unleashes potential. So instead of trying to problem solve, we are trying to look for potential in situations, in people, in ecosystems, and try and operate such that that potential gets realized into actuality. And I think leadership also can be redefined in the sense that we are all called in these current times to be leaders. So it isn't about a hierarchy. It is about developing an inner strengths as a leader, as well as the outer abilities to collaborate and work within teams and organizations and communities and ecosystems. So it's very broad. Everybody can be, should be, must be a regenerative leader, in my opinion. So you know, it's a really it's something that welcomes everybody and values diversity as well, of ideas, opinions, people, backgrounds, etc. So there's my first stab.
That's great. Aimee, you want to try?
Sure. Well, first of all, regenerative is implying that something is being regenerated after having been spent some of the energies, right? So in terms of regenerative leadership, from a permaculture angle, we're looking at taking care of the people, taking care of the planet. So it's not just about extracting as a leader, you go and tell your team, do this and do that. But actually in self-organized spaces, we all have to watch out that we don't get burned out. So we're watching out for each other. We're making sure responsibilities are spread out and that people are actually enjoying what they're doing and not being burned out by what they have to do. I think it's quite tricky in a way that it changes people. So if we see a lot of people who haven't been exposed to regenerative spaces before, not know exactly what to do, because there is no one to tell you necessarily this is your job. You have to kind of step up, and that's the leadership part, that you have to be in a way your own leader, and to step into empowerment so that you can lead with an idea, with an event, or lead with yourself, with your skills. And the other aspect of it is to also be able to say to people, oh, there's a lot on the plate right now, and how are we going to manage this between us? So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said here about self-organized spaces, because leadership is very much misunderstood. We take leadership often to mean hierarchical structures, but that's not necessarily the only way to take leadership. And so regenerative leadership, I think, really speaks to that.
That's great, Christopher.
Well, so back in the 1990s and early 2000, I worked for an English chocolate company called Green and Blacks, working with Maya cacao farmers here in Toledo. And what we found was that top-down pedagogies didn't necessarily work for farmers for translating information, coming down, like a teacher and putting wisdom on a chalkboard, and scribe-like recording wisdom. And that we found that lateral movement of information was actually much more effective. And the leadership, when I took over managing Toledo Cacao Growers Association, was sort of a core cadre of people, most of whom were exceptional farmers, who took it over because there was a vacuum there that needed to be addressed. So I think one of the important concepts behind regenerative leadership would be practitioners who are regenerating land and working in beneficial ways that serve the planet, serve themselves, serve the community around them, and tend to involve lateral movements of information, not hierarchical, as Aimee mentioned, that sort of lateral movement instead of top up, structured top to bottom.
That's great. So my experience of this has been quite, I'm quite new to this. So for me, even working in them self-organized spaces, Aimee, you mentioned that I find it very difficult to make the transition. So sometimes I'm not sure what they do, because you are waiting for that permission.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, how do we encourage people to, how do we try and fix that mindset of going from hierarchical? Because we've been used to it and conditioned it all our lives, to sort of trying to step outside that a wee bit. Because I certainly struggle with it.
It's certainly very challenging. So this is a common experience, what you mentioned, that people come into our self-organized spaces and they need more than just a verbal permission. They need an invitation, they need accompaniment, they need mentorship. And I think that's often lacking also in self-organized spaces, because there's no one, doing that specific job perhaps, or taking responsibility for that. So that's one of the dangers, that you might have a self-organized space where a few people know what they're doing and they're just doing, but other people who want to get involved really need more support. I think the best way that I have seen it done is by inviting, by the people coming in, inviting them to share what their skills are and what they would like to, what they're interested in doing, and then implanting those people into already functioning teams, because then they learn by example and they become more and more empowered very quickly. Whereas if people just lurk around and just observe for a long time, they tend to go cold and say, oh, I've been sitting on the fringes and not really participating. And it's often the case that then they drop out a little bit after. So follow through from onboarding, let's say, to implementation, that's a very critical point, which often falls between the cracks.
Yes, and I would second that, Aimee, as well. And having sort of specific roles that are around kind of mentoring roles, coaching roles, and separating that out from the doing roles. So, you know, it's very hard to be a doer in a group and also trying to create the culture at the same time. So to have that assigned to people, I mean, it can rotate, definitely, you know, can be helpful. And I think, you know, I co-founded a community woodland social enterprise 10 years ago, and although I stepped away from the board 4 years ago, you know, there were various things that we did to try and invite people into that role. One of them it was to explicitly say, so even for events where people had paid to attend, we would say, please come as with the mindset of a participant rather than a consumer, you know, or collaborator, co-creator rather than a consumer, because we're so drilled into that consumerist mindset of, you know, I've paid money, and, you know, my chair is going to be there waiting for me when I arrive. My tea is going to be handed to me, or there just, you know, to be a consumer. You know, so sometimes not having those things. So you know, sometimes with if I run a workshop or something, I deliberately don't put the chairs out. And as people arrive, you know, they're invited to do that, and sort of, you know, automatically then become co-creators of that space. And similarly with sharing refreshments and that kind of thing. So some things can be quite simple, others are much more complex. Yeah.
And Christopher, you mentioned there the sort of teaching the farmers the lateral spread of information. How did that develop in the information sharing?
So I took over Toledo Cacao Growers Association in 1997, in part because basically they were getting letters from Fair Trade and Organic Soil Association asking to respond, and nobody was understanding the language. The language was kind of technical, and so they just let it languish there, sitting there on the desk. And then I was asked to come in by Craig Sams, who started the company Green and Blacks, to help them with that. And then I took over sort of managing it, not as a director, but as sort of a facilitator to keep it moving. And one of the things that we found when we had training, so we built we established an extension program, and what we found was that classroom time was not necessarily very productive. We bring in Dr. Ramirez from Cartier in Costa Rica to come and teach sort of biodiversity management in cacao. And, you know, that sort of top-down pedagogy wasn't working for farmers. So what we would, and in addition, there'd always be this one guy in the crowd. Usually it would be a male, and in his 20s or early 30s, who'd be sitting there like that, you know, and we'd be like, question and answer. Okay, Dr. Ramirez, how much cacao do you have? And he'd say, well, I don't actually have any cacao. But I did my PhD research on blah, blah, woof, woof, and nobody's listening. And everything that he said before that had validity just got devalued. And that we found that by working with farmers, there was a couple of farmers. The first one was my neighbor down the river who died a few years ago, late Mr. Saul Garcia, who has probably the most impressive agroforestry system I've ever seen. And I've been to like 600 farms. And in terms of biological diversity, we did a 25 by 25 meters, and there were 75 plants species in there useful to him, of multiple cultivars of several of the species. And what we found was that the information that Dr. Ramirez from Cate was trying to give the farmers, which wasn't getting much traction, we could present that same information in Mr. Saul Garcia's farm, because his farm was exceptional, and it was a way that farmers would go there. And there's this condescension amongst people who don't work with farmers, that oh, because farmers can't read or write, they're not literate. And the fact of the matter is that they are highly literate. Their literacy tends to be botanic, it tends to be systems, it tends to be soils, it tends to be relationships between elements and systems. And so we could take working on these literacies that the members of the Toledo Cacao Growers Association had, we could present the same information that was being presented by Dr. Ramirez from Cartier at Mr. Saul's farm. And instead of there's this upper class educated Costa Rican guy who doesn't actually have any cacao telling us, there's that guy that's always selling stuff in the market who comes in and is, you know, unloading hundreds of pounds of cacao out at the cacao depot. And so there was an instant validation of anything he said, because people understood that this guy was actually doing it. And on top of that, he looked like them. You know, it's like Mr. Saul. You know, he's from the area. I mean, he's actually mestizo, but he grew up in a Quechua Maya community. There's a story to it, but whatever.
Yeah, that really underlines one of the key principles of regenerative, which is that it has to arise from place. So, you know, we see across several different regenerative disciplines. So permaculture, biomimicry, regenerative economics has this as well. It is that this place-based approach, and you know, in business circles, it's can be quite problematic because people are looking for best practice and, you know, tick box solutions and let's you know, have these criteria that you fulfill and then you get this certification. And regenerative doesn't work like that because, you know, as Christopher so eloquently explained, you know, it came there from the land, but it also came from the people. And then it also came from the potential of the people who were the farmers who were then evolving their practice. So, you know, this kind of evolving from place, realizing potential according to a unique set of circumstances is something that we see everywhere in nature, and is something we really do have to learn from for every business, whether it be a land-based business or, you know, a manufacturing business. You know, there are unique circumstances that need to be looked at before we can even start to think about what changes we might want to make.
I also find it interesting what you said, Christopher, about the people being more receptive when it's someone else in their same shoes communicating that to them, like leading. So in our online spaces, that's a little harder to have an equivalent for, but actually leading by example is very important when you're trying to set up an online community culture, because people look at each other to kind of measure what are the social values in the space, right? And if the social values in the space are written one way, but the behavior is another, then you have a kind of erosion of those values. And that's when it becomes degenerative rather than regenerative, and people move away. So I think that's quite a critical point. And the other one is being of place. So even if there is no physical place necessarily, the fact that people have a shared ethics for permaculture, or they have a shared language and a shared culture, that really helps for this regenerative feel to the interactions to come about. It's also hard to fake. It's not possible to fake this. So you really have to be living the culture and be talking the language. Otherwise, you know, it's not possible to replicate it in a phony way.
Yeah, and I think embracing complexity, embracing the fact that you know, this is a trial and error approach, that you have to learn by doing. There isn't a such thing as perfection. You know, all of those things take courage to step into, and that's why I think having, you know, supportive regenerative spaces for everybody, to have that supportive network of people to ask curious questions, really, because a lot of how we get to what we decide, you know, what decisions we make are made much richer by asking ourselves questions and asking questions of each other. So having those supportive non-judgmental spaces where people can explore issues that are rising out of their unique circumstances, I think that's the way that we, you know, get the most out of this potential and this quite seemingly uncomfortable space that regenerative leaders have to step into, really.
And it's a big ask to ask people who are that's not they're they're not in that space yet, to ask people to be courageous, to step out of their comfort zone, to put themselves forward. This is quite a big ask in energy and commitment also, if they're taking ownership of some task. So yeah, I really resonate with what you said there, Sarah. I think there also needs to be some appreciation and gratitude that this doesn't come naturally to all of us. No, that some of us have to work harder than others to be able to do that.
Yes, and that we are really stepping outside of the current paradigm, which says that as leaders we should always be in control, that if somehow things don't go to plan, it's us who's doing it wrong. It's a totally different paradigm of this mechanistic control hierarchical mindset versus the nature inspired regenerative systems approach that is the reality of our world. And really we're just stepping into reality, but we are actually leaving behind 500 years of mechanistic drumming into us that somehow that's the way to do it. So that definitely needs some courage, some support. And I think that the permaculture principle of edge effect is a really key one here, because there's definitely something around comfort zones with edge. So you've got the edge between two ecosystems is the most productive, the most creative, and we see that in leaders as well. So when people do have that courage to step outside of their comfort zones, to try something new, to try and think differently, to be differently, then that's when the magic starts to happen, really. So remember that permaculture edge effect principle, because you can observe it anywhere. Just go for a walk in the woods and you'll see it, and then you can just start bringing it into your business practices.
At Vine, we've had maybe 5 founders at this stage come and go. So at the start, we just said it was like basically, right, who's the CEO? It was the de facto, who's the COO? So we went straight to the corporate thing. And then instead of chief technology officer, it was chief permaculture officer. We were just getting started. So that's now when you think about it, but that's what I just took a model and says, right, we'll just go with that. So then relationships get strained because roles. We were sort of going for whoever owns it makes the decision in terms of, right, you do this, so you just make all the decisions, and if anyone has a problem with it, just flag it. And then it's like, right, how do we make this properly regenerative, and how do we adopt how do we learn basically about those principles, and then how do we apply them? How do we get from a place of that rigidity to that sort of look in the nature?
So one of the things that I bought when I was 22, I bought a very degraded citrus and cattle farm because it was super, super cheap. It didn't have a road. It didn't really have a house. It didn't have electricity. It didn't have water. We have all of that minus the road. We still come in and out by dugout canoe. So I basically had to come up with ways to repair the land. I bought this degraded land, but I was young and very stupid, and I had no idea it was degraded land. It had citrus on it. There were oranges on the trees, and I didn't notice the sort of dead branches out at the end, which are signs of dieback. I didn't question that it was 27 years old when citrus has sort of starts to be less productive after about year 25. And I ended up with this like dying citrus farm. I got rid of the cattle within the first 6 months because I could see that they were no good. And then I had to take a long time of observation, and that's where we came up with the philosophy of what would now be called the multi-strata agroforestry system, with an emphasis on tropical staple trees for the amount of food that they produce. At that time, there were very few people talking about agroforestry, and in the communities that I live in, and the main people doing agroforestry were doing either cacao dominant agroforestry or, to a much lesser extent, coffee. So there's sort of a multi-strata agroforestry system with a heavy focus on the subcanopy layer. And so I think that a lot of regenerative practices are born out of necessity. People are presented with, hey, I'm degrading my land, or I've inherited this degrading land, or I bought degraded land because I'm young and I can't afford to buy any good land. And so a lot of people getting into regenerative agriculture are getting into it because they're confronted with these realities that were established before they got into agriculture. And so I think that necessity, certainly in our case, has been the mother of invention, and is the way that we came up with the sort of practices that we have to repair degraded land.
Can you apply them? Can you apply them to a degraded company?
Well, I mean, starting with the observation is definitely the way to go. I mean, that, you know, they say that with all permaculture. We in our Think Like a Forest, you know, regenerative organization fundamentals program, that's the first thing we get everybody to do. Just observe your organization without judgment and without trying to fix anything, without, you know, because what we tend to do as human beings, we look at something and go, oh, but I could do that instead, or oh, I shouldn't be doing that. And we're just judging. Whereas if we take that permaculture designer approach and just, you know, imagine you're doing a site survey of your company and literally just mapping what is there. And I don't mean, you know, the physical bits. I mean, kind of, well, we have this team meeting here, and, you know, such and such and such and such get together in the pub on a Thursday and chat about the business. You know, that's your site survey, if you like, and you can get a really good non-judgmental picture of your business to start with, just to see, you know, what how things are, and then having that strong sense of purpose, which, you know, I guess you already have, but just to ensure that everybody involved has got the same purpose. And what we tend to do as well is have individual purpose statements and shared purpose statements. So for example, myself and JK McQuinn, so I'm Think Like a Tree and she's Where the Mind Grows, and we've come together to form Think Like a Forest, which is our business for supporting businesses and organizations. So we essentially did a design process which was kind of, here's my, you know, vision, here's her vision, where do they overlap? And so we've got a really strong shared vision, but which honors our individual businesses and downtime as well. So, you know, we've got very different family situations. You know, I've got land and, you know, she's got other commitments, and we honor all of that. But because we've been really open right from the start about what our shared vision is for this particular project, this particular business. So, you know, starting with observation, then moving on to that visioning process can really help. And sometimes when organizations do this, they realize that there are people in their organization that just are never going to be aligned with their vision, and that's okay. You know, sometimes that happens, and you know, so but when there is a strong vision that people unite behind, then all the rest sort of starts to, you know, then you obviously start to develop, you know, collaboration culture, working practices, but things tend to more naturally fall into place once you're united around that common vision.
There's a really good resource, I think you can find it online. It's a book called Working with Source. I'll have to find out who wrote it now because I don't remember, but it's a very good resource for the people who have or are working with teams and have basically to find out what this vision is and who is holding this vision and how is this being shared. There's some also interesting tools now that are coming from the business world, but they're applicable also to permaculture designs. I mean, we have this like PMI, which is some tools that are used in permaculture design. And I think the ones that are interesting in this context are the Team Onion, which you can also find online. And the Team Onion allows people to self-assess how close or how far they are from the core team. So, you know, you can map the team on it by allowing everyone to basically put themselves how close or how far away they are from the middle. And the other tool is a team canvas. And the team canvas allows the team to basically also self-assess and say, okay, I have so much capacity, I have these skills, I have these interests. This is what I see myself doing in this context. And then everyone can share their individual canvases to have a shared canvas that the whole team can really buy into. And I think this buying into process, and because no one is like the leader, everyone is taking their leadership into doing this exercise by self-assessing, declaring their variables that could be capacity, family situations, other obligations, and so on. It really helps create that regenerative place, because there is no then misunderstanding. So you know that let's say Cormac has young children, and therefore he cannot work I don't know, when he has childcare duties, or that Aimee runs a farm, and when I have harvest I'm not available to be reached. So by having all these knowns, you know, you get rid of all these unknowns, which are really then could be eroding or creating misunderstandings and so on the team. I think there's also another one that's coming to my mind now, is something called the Happy Team Protocol, which is also an interesting tool where people go over what are their expectations and so on. And in terms of sharing compensation, which is also a very good tool, is a Happy Money Story. And this is where people get to talk about expectations around money. How is their money situation? Because we don't like to talk about it. We don't like to talk about money. We are often in self-organized spaces, not salary-based. You know, we are often freelancing, or maybe sharing a funding budget, or, you know, with something more abstract than someone getting a salary. And so conversations around money and our expectations of money and our lived experience of money becomes quite important then. Gosh, that's a lot.
Yes, one that came to mind as well was the forms of capital, which is sometimes expressed as 8 forms of capital, sometimes as 9, depending on how it falls out. But that's a really good one for evaluating a business or organization sort of in ways other than money, in terms of, what resources are available. And that's really really useful for community businesses as well, because we discover, I mean, I do it with individuals as well, but we discover that we're a lot wealthier. Usually we start from a point of view of what I don't have, so it's that scarcity mindset that's always kind of driving. But when we do the 8 or 9 forms of capital, then it starts to shift into that sort of abundance mindset of seeing things in terms of what I do have and using that as a starting point, and then trying to create wealth in a diversity of different ways other than purely money. And I think that is what Aimee mentioned about kind of having conversations around money. That is really really important, because people have vastly different needs in terms of money, often in community spaces, especially. And we need to be open. I mean, transparency is something overall that I think we see being valuable in regenerative spaces. Just having transparency with regard to everything from money to information to knowledge to skills. Being transparent is really important.
That's actually an important distinction to make. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's right.
The concept of wealth, and I am an exceptionally wealthy person in every way except for cash. My bank account is not good. I have a difficult relationship with money. Really good at spending it, not very good at making it. And I think part of this because I'm spread all over the place with what we do here. So there's only a few things we actually market. But in other ways, I have a very good high quality of life. I live well, I eat well, I enjoy what I do. When Selene and I worked with just a couple of weeks ago, we were up in the north of the country working with women, teaching them how to grow vanilla, which is sort of a lost art in Belize. And Belize is part of where vanilla originated from, and there's very few vanilla farmers here. And so we got paid for that. We didn't get paid a lot, but I mean, it was nice. And so I think that the understanding of wealth and the different forms of wealth is very important, which is when Sarah was talking about the multiple forms that wealth comes in, I think that an acknowledgement to yourself of that you are that you have a wealth, some form of wealth that you may not be cash, but that you are still fortunate, you're still good, is a really good way to move forward on anything, because then you're not coming from this feeling of, man, it's not working out for me because look at my bank account, I got $6 and I owe 50 or whatever. So just when you touched on that, it triggered something in me, because I think that the fact of the matter is that the more we organize around spaces where people's wealth is acknowledged or is used to people's advantages, the better off we are.
What I was going to say there in terms of transparency is for my diploma, I'll be implementing this in my business. So you should give me some great structure here that I can use and some great examples. Have you any used things you want to ask each other about it, or make have we not covered anything? Because we've had the example.
I'm curious from Christopher. I know nothing about Belize. I'm curious whether there are sort of is there an Indigenous perspective on this that you've come across in terms of, when I've in my limited research around North American Indigenous perspectives, there are things like reciprocity that come up, relationship, these sort of values, I guess, that we see in certain, in Indigenous people. Have you come across that sort of in your location?
More about social mores than anything codified, the way people treat each other and talk to one another. They are just done differently here. Confrontations, at least in Maya communities, are usually established often over talking, and where the people don't look at each other. And so I got into a conflict with some student, and he's like, dude, you won't even look at me. And I was like, oh. And I told him, I said, I think that's because I've learned not to look away respectfully and talk my position and listen to the other person without acknowledging, without looking at them, not being confrontational. So there's certain mores in terms of regenerative agriculture. There's lots of practices. A lot of those are disappearing now. When I worked at Cacao Growers, the conception amongst the board of directors at Toledo Cacao Growers was that anybody that used herbicides was either stupid or lazy or both. And then last year we were working with maize and beans farmers up in some border communities doing survey work. And we found that basically every single farmer now is using herbicides. That's the norm. It's become the norm. So I think I got slightly off the topic to the answer. But I think that a lot of the indigenous world here in Belize, with the Quechua and the Mopan Maya in Toledo district, and then the Yucatec Maya in northern Belize, and then of course the Garifuna people on the coast, a lot of their cultural a lot of the culture is being changed and homogenized through a combination of American TV, the internet, youth culture, sort of homogenization. And then the insidious introduction of, in agriculture at least, the insidious introduction of agrotechnologies that basically mine out and sap underneath millennia of accumulated indigenous knowledge in agriculture. And we see that a lot. I mean, that's ongoing. So I'm way off the original question. But to say yes, there are indigenous practices that are regenerative, but most of it is social mores, how people treat one another, how people talk to one another, deference for age, which I always liked. And you can never win an argument with a farmer once they trot out grandpa, because, oh, well, I do it this way because grandpa did it that way. Well, you can't argue with grandpa. Yeah. Sorry, I kind of went off.
No, it's super interesting, because I do find fascinating, that in regenerative circles and books and that I've come across, that the people are referencing a lot more, quite rightly, that Indigenous perspective. I'm kind of thinking of Carol Sanford here. So she's got the regenerative business. So her grandfather was Native American. I've forgotten which people he was from, but she references some of his wisdom in her books, which are very corporate. She's very firmly rooted in the corporate world, I like that sort of that feeling that we're not just learning from nature, we're learning from people who also learnt from nature and didn't necessarily lose it along the way, as we did in the Western world.
So, it's one of the things that's come up in permaculture. I have somebody I know remotely. I've never met them. We have many mutual friends. He's a Native American, and he boldly declared that permaculture is just stealing indigenous knowledge. And I was like, not exactly. And I explained that often, if you rigorously apply permaculture principles to a landscape, you'll come up with something parallel to what indigenous people do or have done, where it's not necessarily plagiarism, but it's approaching it through the framework of permaculture principles and arriving at a similar place. And it's a touchy thing, because he was not ready to honestly hear that, and so I mean, I didn't push it. I just explained my personal observation, that if you apply permacultural principles to a landscape, you're going to come up with probably best design, and it may have been similar to design work done over millennia by cultures who lived in that same space that you're working in.
The permaculture movement has done really great work recently at recognizing the roots of indigenous teachings in permaculture, which I think is quite good work, but we still have a way to go to, let's say, decolonize permaculture and on technology's roots. That's, I think, also a part of regenerative leadership in the movement itself. And how are we conducting ourselves as permaculture teachers and designers when we are communicating about permaculture, that we acknowledge where this knowledge comes from, and that we want to celebrate these cultures and to promote them, not to appropriate any of the knowledge.
It's another thing in terms of regenerative leadership is there's I'm 57 years old. I've been doing this. Next month it'll be complete 35 years ago that I started farming, and I was confronted with, I had to swim across the river in a flood to get a canoe. It's whole story, stuff that I could have done easily in my 20s, and I was halfway across the river, and I realized that I'm not in my 20s anymore. I'm like, this would be a really stupid way to drown, and so one of the things that the older heads in the room, which is probably me, is we need to start thinking about how do we seed space in what we're doing to make room for younger people who can continue this when we are unable to or unwilling to. I mean, I have a stack of books I'd like to read, and I'm never going to get around to it until I like make time for that. And one of the ways to do that is to start to seed that. So my wife and I have, in the last few years, have started putting former students in positions of teaching parts of our permaculture design courses. We had a former student when we were teaching the women up in the north of the country how to grow vanilla. We asked her to come with us. She's an indigenous woman from the village we live in. She's my compadre's niece. And so, and that felt really good because I can't do this forever. Like I said, I'm 57. I'm coming up with body limitations fairly more than I'd like. Like I fall down, I don't bounce back up the way I did. You know, it's like, I cracked a rib. That's going to suck for the next 6 weeks, you know. So yeah, I mean, that's another way of making space for people is to understand that we're not going to be here forever, and make room for younger generations to step up and do work.
I think that's really important, and that designing for succession, you know, in say community groups can be in there right from the start. So I mentioned the community woodland social enterprise that I co-founded 10 years ago. You know, it was always the plan that I would, you know, be a co-founder permaculture designer, but that I would step away and leave, you know, space for new people coming along. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite happened in the way that I'd hoped, and I left a bit more prematurely than I wanted to before that endeavor was done to my satisfaction. So they are definitely having some issues around it being, you know, older people. And you know, you've got to be really active in that process, you know, like you are being, Christopher. You know, you can't just expect a group of older people in a community space to be naturally welcoming to young people who come along with new ideas and new energies. That's got to be sort of designed in, and we can be very deeply inspired by the living systems that we always are in permaculture. You know, that succession is a natural process, that you know, the great oak has to fall down in the forest to give light to the, you know, the new sapling that's waiting to emerge. And we need to be really, you know, designing that in very, very actively.
And that takes also a lot of energy and a lot of thought and people to be on board with the idea, because what you don't want to happen is you go out and do a whole campaign to, I don't know, recruit under 20s. Then they come in and the space is not friendly or it's not prepared for them. People aren't really helping. And that's quite interesting, because what I see in the permaculture movement is there's quite a division between the youth and permaculture part and the more adult or the older movement. And I think we need more better transition and friendlier spaces that regenerative leaders today can absolutely prepare and design to make that succession happen, let's say, more fluidly.
But I think so. The landscape you can see behind me, that was citrus, and I think I took that photo like 10 or 12 years ago, and it was citrus, and we basically managed succession to go with. We had certain species that we were pioneer species that fixed nitrogen or built soil or loosened soil or and provided yield, and eventually we came up with that. And that's what we were aiming for. And once you establish the process and the species selection, it's actually really, really easy. It's not overly complicated. People, on the other hand, are extremely complicated. And it's one of the things that I say, like, what do you not like about permaculture? And I'm like, well, you know, people. Because we might not all be on the same page today, or we're all on the same page tomorrow, or that you know, there's a misunderstanding, or somebody, you know, their agenda changed, or whatever. I like plants and animals are much easier to deal with than even when they're difficult, because you kind of know how that's going to go. But people are so dynamic. And through their own personal growth, they change, or they regress, or whatever. So that's the problem that I face in terms of when we have people here helping us on the farm. We don't have any students anymore. We closed for like 3 years, which has been both a relief, because then I you know, just more us time, which is nice. Well, my compadre comes, you know, 3-4 times a week, sometimes more. And so we work together. But every now and then my compadre will kill a tree. He killed a tree the other day, and it's truthfully, it's a tree that doesn't have any real, doesn't produce anything. The wood isn't anything, but it had a place that I liked. And I remember thinking, I talked about it with my wife. I said, well, you know, she said, well, you're upset about it, because it was a plant, whose Latin name I've forgotten, but it's called horse's balls, and it was growing on top of a boulder and through the roots around it. I just admired its tenacity. And so my wife said, if you're unhappy about it, you should probably tell your compadre, but think about what the return on that's going to be. You know, are you going to hurt his feelings? And I said, you know, and then once I heard that, I was like, you know, tree just wasn't that important, and enough. So anyway, I guess for a lot of adventures, like particularly what we do, you get so invested in what you're doing that it's really hard to cede control of it. And it's one of the challenges that we've had in the past when we've had people working with us, is to try to give people control of certain aspects, without micromanaging them, or backseat driving, or whatever the term you want to use. So one of those are some of the limitations that we see in sort of managing personal succession.
What I was thinking was the difference between kind of doing and being, because permaculturists are usually doers. I mean, I'm a huge doer, and I started at, you know, we bought a small holding 20 years ago, and, you know, kind of done all the permaculture, the tree planting, the community woodland, everything. You know, I'm a doer, but it was actually through a realization around the people side, in both in myself through a chronic illness and through relationships with, you know, in the community, that I realized that actually this is where I needed to put my energy, because that's the hard bit, like you were saying, Christopher, and that's why I kind of dedicated the last few years to researching these type of tools and resources, to, you know, and ways of being in the world that can run alongside doing, that are what is going to make it work. So it's, you know, it's that combination of being and doing that we have to, you know, that takes effort, really. Sorry, Aimee, what were you going to say something?
It's okay. The Christopher story reminded me of once when I got very upset with a volunteer because they threw away something I was fermenting, and they just thought it was going off. And it reminded me of because I completely lost my temper. I was so angry. And then because of this, memory, let's say, I also had to apologize later when I cooled down and everything, and they were completely fine with it, except they thought maybe I was a bit crazy. But there's some interesting tools that we use in the collab that you might find interesting. One is the trauma-informed collaboration, which is basically an effort to understand why people behave sometimes in the way that they do. So there might be some past trauma. So let's say when I lost my temper, right, that was a trauma response. It wasn't because the volunteer that I cared so much about this one jar, but it triggered something in me, maybe loss of control or whatever. So trauma-informed collaboration helps us to be more compassionate towards the people that we collaborate with, because we may not know everything that they have been through. And the second one is a conflict transformation technique. So this is where we shine a spotlight on not only what is this conflict about, but what we are bringing into the conflict. So our own biases, our own belief system, and even when we say to someone, go in the garden and do what you want, you know, start a herb garden, and you give them some seeds and off they go. And then you're upset because it's round instead of square, or it's in a grid, or they broke your favorite watering can. So this sort of, you know, what it asks us to look at ourselves as what are we bringing into this conflict? What's our energy like? How much capacity do we have to dealing with this emotionally right now? and so on. So these are very, I think, valuable tools, not only for managing volunteers, but in our families and our personal lives, but most importantly in community projects and self-organized spaces where there is no boss to say, you and you, shake hands, off you go. You know, you have to make that effort. You have to really bring yourself back to the table you've walked away from so that you can continue to work. And that's very difficult sometimes.
Yeah, it is definitely harder when it's volunteers. One tool that I absolutely love is compassionate communication or nonviolent communication. Marshall Rosenberg's techniques around communication, but also understanding the needs that are the needs and the feelings that are lying behind behaviors, because we've all got universal needs that come to the fore at different times, but those needs can be expressed in very different ways. So for example, you know, in a group situation, somebody might be expressing a need to be heard, but that might come out in one person as anger and shouting, you know, listen to me, why aren't you listening to me? And on the other hand, it might be somebody withdrawing and sitting in the corner or walking out of the room, and the need is absolutely the same, but the feeling behind it and the behavior are very different. So if we can actually identify what need is either being met or not met in a particular situation, either in ourselves or in other people, then we can respond to that in a much more appropriate way. Because it's easy when somebody's shouting to then just shout back, and you end up, you know, with this conflict. Whereas if you can, you know, have some language to say, you know, I can see that you're feeling upset, you know, is it perhaps because you're feeling the need to be heard, can really diffuse the situation and give them a voice to then express, well, no, actually it was because I did blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly you totally transform the energy, because people are being listened to at that really fundamental level that we all have to have our basic needs met. So yeah, so it's a tool that is absolutely brilliant and transformatory, really, for any family or group situation.
And you remind me of another tool as well, which is basically the meeting check-in.
Yeah.
This is like invaluable tool, because you automatically know at the start of the meeting if someone's in a foul mood, if they need to eat, if they need to drink, if they're too hot or too busy or too tired to be here. And that really avoids a lot of problems later, I think. So, and that doesn't take much time, right?
No, that's right. And it's surprising how many meetings that you go to, say community meetings, or you know, and there may be not even that many people there, where there is no acknowledgement of everybody in the room. You know, so even if it's a one word go round, so if you know, if you had 50 people in a room, obviously, you know, you can't take the whole meeting up with a go round and check in, but just to acknowledge, you know, people's names, or that is huge in you know, people feeling welcome in a space. Because what we all do quite naturally is make up stories, and when we go into a new space, many people will have already written the story that they believe is going to happen in that space. So they, you know, they're nervous when they go in for the first time, and they're thinking, okay, so that, you know, and this is subconscious often. It's, you know, sometimes it's conscious, but often it is subconscious, to do with things that might have happened in our past. So, you know, oh, well, I'll go into that meeting, and if I'm not acknowledged, it's because you know, that nobody's interested in what I'm saying. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people are, you know, they're not welcomed, and then they don't come back, and then we wonder why. But like you say, Aimee, having that acknowledgement of people, and the what a check-in does is says, are you okay? That goes beyond just you're here. It's I care enough to ask you if you're okay and how you are. You know, that's huge, and really often missed. you know, in permaculture, it's pretty, you know, often pretty good, I think. But in other, you know, community spaces, I'm always quite despairing that doesn't happen.
I think here too, for us, I mean, for me, it's a cultural thing. When you go, well, how's it going? And somebody goes, oh, not good. You go, oh no, why did I ask?
Oh no, I shouldn't have asked. But you also get the other way around, you know, you get the people who say they're fine, but they're not fine. And then you notice in the meeting something's not right. And then you wonder again, you know, sometimes we interrupt meetings because of this. We say, you're a little bit withdrawn. Like, is everything okay here? Shall we have a pause, or do we do a grounding? That's another tool when you can do a short pause where people can center their attention to what they're doing. But I remember being in a small guild, which is like 3 people working in a small group on a project, and we started with 1-hour meetings, but I remember the check-ins were getting longer and longer. I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't do this. Like, I can't do a 1-hour meeting and half of it is check-in, right? But it wasn't possible for this. There was one person who was taking up a lot of time, and it wasn't possible for this person to start doing the work without doing the check-in. And that was, obviously, there was a bigger need than could be fulfilled in that group, because the group was meeting for a specific purpose. And the check-in was completely on a very deep and personal and problematic level. So that was a really big challenge. We made the meeting, I think, 90 minutes instead of 1 hour, and that still wasn't doing it. And at one point we had to say, okay, we need to either put a time limit, or we need to have additional support meetings outside of this one that are more on a mutual support basis. And from that, we had created a monthly meeting, which was basically simply for check-in. That's all we did. And people could come and talk about how they're feeling, what they're experiencing also in some workspaces or on a personal level, and we would just be a mutual aid group. So there are ways to be dealing with this, but yes, it's an interesting challenge when you have to do work, but you also want to do the personal, and you want to be human, because we work with each other as humans, right? So we have to acknowledge that we have human problems, but at the same time we need to do the work. So there's the striking the balance and thinking a bit outside of the box how to achieve this.
Yes, one of the things that we do is when we've got a slightly bigger group is do a check-in in a form of an analogy. So it might be kind of, one of them we call the weather report. So, you know, check in, how are you feeling today, and describe it as the type of weather that you are. And the interesting thing about that, so if you say, how are you, like Aimee said, people will go, oh, I'm fine, you know, because that is, you know, that's learned behavior, isn't it, from, you know, conditioning of you. Somebody asks you how you are, you just say, yes, I'm fine. Whereas if you say, what weather are you, you end up with like amazingly sort of creative, interesting things that actually are really insightful. Because, you know, if somebody says, oh, I feel like, you know, a tree where, you know, the wind's blown it over, you know, you can really get the energy of how that person is feeling. So, you know, there are creative ways about getting that out there, without it necessarily. It's a balance, isn't it? Because if you've got a smaller group, then you want to go deeper probably, and then a bigger group, you've got to manage the time, you know, while still acknowledging everybody. So do you feel fully resourced now, Cormac?
Yeah, as always, it always takes a direction I never thought. It was great to hear everybody. Sarah, you had some books to share. Do you want to just quickly go through them? Because Christopher hasn't got enough books on his list.
Oh yeah, so I've just got a few. So the one I've just read is the Regenerative Enterprise, and in fact, I've just done a book review on the Think Like a Tree blog of that one. That is really good. It's a really good, like, basic introduction. I mean, there's a huge amount in it. There's nothing basic about it, but it's actually really easy to read. The two by, well, there's Regenerative Leadership by Giles Hutchins and Laura Storm. That's absolutely brilliant. And then Leading by Nature, which is by Giles Hutchins as well. Anything by Carol Sanford. She's got a really good podcast as well called The Business Second Opinion, all about regenerative business. And of course, I mean, it's not explicitly leadership, but there's huge amount of value for leaders, which is of course Daniel Christian Weil's Designing Regenerative Cultures, which is an absolutely, handbook for everything regenerative, really. And he always says start with questions. So, if you want to know where to start, just start with thinking about what questions you need to ask as well. Now, with Think Like a Forest, we do have a weekly regenerative business free email newsletter, and so I do share a lot of books, podcasts, activities, insights, nature stuff on that weekly. So you can find that through the Think Like a Tree website, and sign up for that. So yeah, I'm a bit of a squirrel when it comes to reading regenerative books. I like sharing them with people as well, and on LinkedIn as well I usually share book reviews and things like that.
I just wanted to interject. Daniel Christian Wall is a friend of mine. I met him at the Commonwealth, and we clicked right away. We went to some meeting that was about regenerative. It was about finance for regenerative and carbon drawdown projects, and one of the people was talking about return on investment and opportunities, and he and I were looking at each other like, really, because we were thinking like, how do we we're facing a planetary crisis, and we have a limited amount of time to deal with it. And they were talking about it's a recurring thing that I encounter in those spaces where they're talking about climate change and funding for climate change projects, is what's the return on the project? It's like, well, your grandkids have a planet that's habitable. But anyway, I saw you mention Daniel Christian Wall's book, which I absolutely loved. It's a fantastic book, one of the most important books I've read in the last few years. And also I think very highly of him as a person as well.
Absolutely. And he speaks with such integrity, and he's really, happy to get into the weeds of what it really means to be regenerative, and keeps people on track, I think, really, really well, in a compassionate way. So yeah, a really, really good starting point there.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks very much. Do you just want to go a quick round robin, just where people can find you? Do you want to go first, Christopher?
Okay, well, our webpage crashed at some point during the pandemic, and we haven't rebuilt it. So, but I can be found at Christopher.Nesbitt, Nesbitt, at mmrfbz.org, which is my email address. Alternately, we maintain a Facebook page. Some students bullied me into making a Facebook page for the farm, and people can reach me there. I have a LinkedIn account, but I very seldom use it. And I will eventually rebuild our webpage. And I have a WhatsApp, so I'm hip and in the know, man. You can call me. Whatever.
Aimee, do you want to go next there?
Sure. People can find me on LinkedIn with my name, Aimee Fenech, and they can find the International Permaculture Collab on their website, perma.earth. And if you are curious, then you can get in touch and we can talk more about it.
Sarah?
So it's thinklikeatree.co.uk, and I'm on LinkedIn, very happy to connect with anybody, and I'm also on Instagram and Facebook and whatever. So yeah, really, really happy to connect with everybody, and we have got a load of free stuff on there for workbooks and quizzes, regenerative business quizzes, and emails and all sorts of things. So check out the website for all that free content as well.
That's great. And for the audience, thanks very much for listening. That's been the Permaculture Vine, and I'll catch you all next week. Cheers.